Welcome back. Debate Showdown. Across the country, key midterm debates were held between candidates running up and down the ballot for top jobs like governor and U.S. Senate.
Our primary responsibility is the safety of Floridians. And Senator, 24 years in elected office, and you have not yet risen to that occasion. And then when asked about it, you say something that makes no sense.
We'll talk about some of the most notable issues discussed, the key players, and who won. Plus, Prime Minister Liz Truss of the UK resigned from the top job yesterday, creating yet another contest to select a British Prime Minister, the UK's third Prime Minister in just 2 months, putting the embattled nation down another politically divisive road. We'll be taking a look at those stories and more today, October 21st, 2022. From Ishaan Media, this is the Ishaan S Show, a podcast about the interesting and ever-changing world of American politics, with me, your host, Ishaan. Hello. Glad to have you all back at the show today. This past week in politics, and indeed global politics, has been quite enticing. For my foreign policy buffs out there, you know that there are some pretty interesting and unique stories that everyone seems to be talking about. And it's not just the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has certainly earned its own category in the news bulletins everywhere. I'm guessing most people are usually poised to think that when somebody says, let's talk politics, they instantly veer to people like Donald Trump, Barack Obama, and think about political divisiveness in general. And that's generally here at home. But domestic politics in the United States is a pretty big part of the way a pretty big part of what people like myself discuss. But don't forget that geopolitics is a whole other realm in this interesting world of politics. There are news stories and political arenas around the world that impact you every day. Some of you might think, oh shoot, there's more politics that I have to keep track of. And others might think, wow, there's one more thing to impact my life. But regardless, it's something we should all care to learn more about. So for one of this week's top stories, let's use a more global lens to take a look at an interesting story from across the world. So for this story, as you might have heard in the opening, we are going to go to London in the United Kingdom. Now, before I get into this, I want to explain to you guys how a parliamentary system of government works. I know it's a boring civics lesson, but you kind of need to know to understand the story. Let's use the U.S. House of Representatives as an example for a comparison. So in this example, we'll call the U.S. House a parliament. It's very similar. Your members of parliament are like congresspeople elected to seats in the legislature, and then they vote on bills and stuff. Now, each member of the House would belong to a certain party. We're familiar with that. But now what's different is that the majority party then gets to elect a leader. This leader is known as the Prime Minister. They're basically like the president of their country. They control their Congress and their executive branch. It's almost like imagining if Nancy Pelosi was the Speaker of the U.S. House, was the leader of the United States, as in held the job of Speaker, but also held all the responsibilities of President instead of President Biden himself. These prime ministers then get to select members of their majority party, the one that they lead, so in this case, other House members, to cabinet positions. Now, unlike the way it's here in the U.S., PMs don't actually have to confirm their appointees. They pick and choose at their will and fire whoever they like. That's what you really need to know for this story, so that's some parliamentary basics for you. Now, anyway, our British friends, some of whom are definitely listening right now, are experiencing something similar to a political crisis. Let me explain. So a lot of people, I'm sure, know that the UK not very long ago had a very Donald Trump-esque prime minister named Boris Johnson. Johnson was a pretty well-liked prime minister in his country. He did a lot of big things and delivered a huge majority for his party, for the Conservatives, in 2019. And he ran on his own platform, unlike what we had seen for a few years prior. Well, in July, after a huge buildup of scandals, mistakes, and quite to be frank, screw-ups, members of Johnson's party and cabinet began resigning in droves, and the people staying behind urged him to call it quits, saying that he could no longer serve as prime minister. That was its own can of worms, and actually, that was all unfolding in the last few episodes, when we were recording the last few episodes of season 2. I never was able to cover it, however, regrettably, but it was all unfolding around that time. And so after all of that backlash, Prime Minister Boris Johnson did end up resigning on July 7th. This resignation then immediately triggered a leadership contest within the Conservative Party to select a new leader and therefore a prime minister. Because remember, there's no VP. The prime minister is the leader of the majority party, and so they needed to select a new leader. After a few rounds of voting, it became a close, not so close race between Johnson's Foreign Secretary Liz Truss and Chancellor, or Treasury Secretary, Rishi Sunak. The biggest issue of the campaign was inflation and the huge cost of living crisis in the UK, which had been far worse in comparison to other countries. President Biden may have been liking to see that a bit. Liz Truss campaigned on cutting taxes big time and sending more relief to the British people, which was seen as the more populist option, while Sunak campaigned on being fiscally responsible, trying to pay back debts, rather than cutting taxes, what many saw as the more pragmatist option. Long story short, Truss ended up winning. Truss then replaced Johnson as prime minister on September 6th, and with that, she brought in new hopes for conservatives about their woes that they had been experiencing under the last few weeks of Boris Johnson. They thought that Prime Minister Truss was here to solve their problems about the cost of living crisis by making these huge tax cuts. But tragically, before that could happen, just 2 days into her premiership, Liz Truss had to report to the nation that Queen Elizabeth II had passed away. This forced Truss to scrap most of her plans since her nation went into a state of mourning, and she had this unprecedented responsibility of managing the state funeral, the formalities, and indeed the security for the global event. All of that stuff was further up her priority list. But then after the funeral, Truss's plan did go into full swing. She went right at it. And so she, with her chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, made some huge cuts to tax policy in their country, in addition to a few other notable pieces of fiscal policy. Generally, what I had been seeing in people in British politics say is that these were quite unorthodox moves, since she pursued a relatively old method of economics. It's not that it's old, it's just not as common or not the go-to option anymore, but a method of economic reconciliation known as trickle-down economics. If you're a student of U.S. history, you might be connecting that with Reaganomics, which was a policy where taxes were cut for people on the higher end of the income spectrum, with the expectation that the money that they save would be invested into the economy and therefore create more money and help more people. Truss branded her tax cuts, similar to Reaganomics, as Trussonomics. So, interesting thing she did there. Now, when Reagan did Reaganomics, it had a lot of good and a lot of bad effects for the average person and impacts on the economy, who were definitely struggling when he was elected. That's why its success is so hotly debated. Like, there are people who are starkly in opposition to what Reaganomics did. However, on the other hand, there are people that are extremely proud of what Reaganomics achieved. However, with Trussonomics, well, it sucked. Trussonomics showed to have failed miserably, beyond what most people beyond what most people realize. Her policies were big, I must admit. They were bold. And they were big suggestions for a very big time in British history. But the markets quickly rejected the policy. No matter how bold and brave it might have seemed, the markets did not like this. And it sent bond values or currency holdings into free fall. The UK's currency, the pound, fell to a nearly 4-decade low in comparison to the US dollar. I've said it before, I'm not an economist. I look at the politics of things. And let me tell you, though, the way the economy was being run under this administration, oh boy, the politics was not looking good. It seemed mismanaged and disastrous. After the not-so-exciting results and showings, Truss actually ended up firing her very short-serving Chancellor, Kwarteng, and instead hired former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt to be the new economy chief. Within a few days of coming into office, Hunt basically reversed most of Truss's plans, basically the plans on which she was elected to introduce. People were joking that Hunt was now running the show because Liz Truss, as many people were saying, had no purpose of being the prime minister if she could no longer deliver on what she promised. The opposition party, Labour, went after her like crazy. But even worse, members of her own party, the Conservative Party, went after her and criticized her. That's a shocker. That's not something a party leader wants on their plate. Then polling came out. Labour had a field day. In that recent poll, Labour was projected to win something like 400 seats, which is a huge, resounding majority not seen since the 1990s. And Conservatives were on the other hand, were set to lose dozens of seats to an over 100-year low. This was all on Liz Truss's watch. And the confidence in Liz Truss's premiership began to dwindle right in front of everybody in just a matter of a few days. And she kept making the headlines for all the wrong reasons. And then one of the biggest high-profile resignations came in from Truss's Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, who resigned for a different reason. She says it was a mistake that she had made, breaching ministerial conduct. But if you read her resignation letter, you could tell that she was trying to abandon a sinking ship. So it's funny. I had actually been writing the script for this, and all of that information was written in about Wednesday night. And then Thursday morning, which is this morning, we record on Thursdays. Thursday morning, Liz Truss actually had a special visitor, the chairman of the influential 1922 committee. The 1922 committee is a special committee that tries to look at prime minister selection processes and no confidence, stuff like that. So the chairman, Sir Graham Brady, ended up visiting Downing Street, the British White House, and informed Truss that she had just a few hours to fix the economic crisis or resign. Truss resigned. Here's a clip of Truss's statement on her resignation.
We set out a vision for a low-tax, high-growth economy that would take advantage of the freedoms of Brexit. I recognise, though, given the situation, I cannot deliver the mandate on which I was elected by the Conservative Party. I have therefore spoken to His Majesty the King to notify him that I am resigning as leader of the Conservative Party.
So, is this Liz Truss's fault? Yes, it really is. Her political collapse was all her doing. She messed up. But who wouldn't have? That's the big question. I feel maybe anybody that was set to take office in such a dire situation was going to face something like this. And in my view, sometimes in politics, no matter who you put up, even the smartest of the smart, there will be a person that just takes a hit so that they can introduce the next guy. Truss is out now. We'll keep a track of the race to her successor, which actually should be a very short process. They plan on getting that announced, all the election and everything done by next Friday, which is a week from today. All right. That was a lot of British politics. When we come back from the break, I will fly back to American politics for Midterm Watch to talk about this past week in midterm debates. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back after this short break. All right, welcome back to Midterm Watch. So we're going to shift gears a little from the UK political crisis and talk about debates. Now, I know debates sound like a really boring topic to talk about, but in politics, debates are basically the primetime TV events never to miss. They're usually where most of the electorate gets to meet the candidates and gets to hear them speak on the issues. It's the best source for one-liners, attacks, and sometimes really embarrassing screw-ups. Those are the funniest. But anyway, candidates across the country went face-to-face with each other in key states like Florida, Georgia, and Wisconsin to discuss some of the most heated issues of this election cycle, including the inflation crisis, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, among other key issues. Let's first take a look at Georgia. As I've said on the show previously, Georgia is incredibly important for Republicans and Democrats because it's more than likely going to decide the landscape of the results of the midterms and summarize an entire election. It'll come down to just that state again. And it's the reason I say that is because in 2020, Senate control was basically on the hinge of Democrats basically win. It was set up on the catalyst of Democrats winning the state of Georgia. Without Democrats winning both seats in Georgia, they would not have had their Senate majority. President Biden would not have been able to get what he wanted done. So this year, it's the same thing. And because Georgia is always so close now, it's not hard to imagine that it comes back down to Georgia again. Because it is arguably the best indication of where the current country currently stands. It might be the most reflective of the nation's views because it's so split. For the Senate, incumbent Senator Raphael Warnock went up against Herschel Walker on Friday. They had a second debate scheduled, but Republican Walker did not show up. So we'll just take a look at the first round, and I'll say that it was an interesting one. I only say so because attacks were hurled, positions were defended, and then interestingly, there was one point where they were talking about law enforcement and I think gun violence, and Walker just, in order to show a message, he pulled out a police badge on the debate stage to show that he stands with law enforcement. It was against the rules. It was funny to watch, and you're not supposed to give your opinion, but I'll be honest, even I laughed when I saw him do that because it was totally unnecessary. He really did not have to do that, but I guess he did. But anyway, here are some notable moments from the Georgia debate.
Well, I'm glad that we finally passed the first gun safety law in 30 years. And we did that on a bipartisan basis. I believe that this law will indeed save lives, and I'd like to see us work and see what we can achieve beyond that on a bipartisan basis.
Well, first of all, any law or bill passed that will affect anyone's Second Amendment, I'm not going to stand for, and I won't support. But third, to hear Senator Warnock talks about supporting law enforcement is sad because he's called them names. And because of the name calling he's done, the morale is down, recruitment is down, only because of what he's done. He's empowered criminals to think they're better than the police.
I ask you to put that prop away.
Well, it's not a prop. This is real. And he said, I have a problem. I never worked with law enforcement.
It is considered a prop, Mr. Walker.
Yes.
Excuse me, sir.
Yes.
You're very well aware of the rules, aren't you?
Well,
aren't you aware of the rules?
He brought up the truth. Let's talk about the truth.
Thank you for putting that prop away.
Walker is trailing Senator Warnock by 3 percentage points. I think the entire country is really interested in seeing where this race goes from here and whether or not the debates had any impact on this very crucial race. Okay, now let's talk about the Georgia gubernatorial debate. Stacey Abrams, that's a name you might be familiar with. The Democrat in this race actually ran 4 years ago against incumbent Republican governor, another familiar name we covered on the show, Brian Kemp. Back when Abrams ran in 2018, the results were ridiculously close. This year, however, things are looking a little more boring and a little more on point for Georgia, which is a more Republican state at its heart. Brian Kemp has had 4 years under his belt as governor. He oversaw the COVID pandemic, oversaw some major social issues, including the heartbeat bill, which many people consider the framework for a lot of the abortion bans that happened across the country before the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and economic swell in Georgia, economic boom. Abrams had a lot of stuff going for her, and she seemed like a really talented candidate at the time. So it was interesting to see her in this debate because it kind of seems like Abrams has lost her star power. She is currently, unlike 4 years ago, lagging 5 points behind in the polls. And I like to say that right now, polls are generally a little more kind to the incumbent party than maybe it should be. So her fate might not even be destined for a 5-point loss. Abrams had a lot of momentum behind her in 2018, and she ran on the fuel of that for her campaign. Her campaign ran on the fuel from that and tried to propel her to national prominence, which it did. And many people say that Stacey Abrams is monumental in the reason that Georgia turned blue in 2020. So it's a very weird thing to look at, that this candidate is not performing nearly as well as people once thought she did. And we've seen her perform well before. And that was in 2018. That was a blue wave year. That was when Donald Trump was president. That was when the electorate was going out in the midterms to reject Donald Trump. So this year, when it's projected to be a red wave year, when Republicans are going to more likely come out to vote against Joe Biden, well, if Stacey Abrams is not doing that well and is in such a close race, maybe it might shift a little more to the right, only because her prospects may not be set up as high. And maybe Brian Kemp in all honesty, is a bit more of a mediocre candidate. And I'll be honest there. When he ran in 2018, he was seen as a mediocre Republican candidate. It's the same thing this year, except for the thing that made him that brought him into the headlines, and the reason we covered him on this show was because actually Donald Trump launched a very tough primary challenge against Brian Kemp this year, because Brian Kemp did not decertify the results of the 2020 election, something that Donald Trump really wanted him to do. And because of that, Donald Trump basically tried to kick Brian Kemp out of office through a Republican primary with the help of Georgia gubernatorial candidate and former senator who lost to one of the senators that won in 2020, David Perdue. David Perdue ended up losing in the primary by a much larger margin than Trump would have hoped for. And so Brian Kemp kind of sailed on that high. So anyway, back to Abrams. I don't really know what happened to Abrams, but she is not doing what we have seen her do before. Okay, and as for the debate itself, fitting with the theme of this election, was bland. There wasn't anything special about it. Nobody spoke of the urgency to have to come out and vote the way both candidates did in 2018. So as high as the stakes are for both parties in this election, it's simply mediocre. There was an interesting exception, however. Third-party Libertarian candidate Shane Hazel was present at this debate, and while his chances of winning are slim, he does interestingly pose the risk for both parties of sending this election into a runoff, which means if neither candidate gets 50%, then there will be another round of voting with the top two candidates who will then each have to try to get 50%. And maybe Shane Hazel may not win, but interestingly enough, he might actually be the reason that this election goes into a runoff. And it might be, if it goes into a runoff because of him, it'll most likely be Stacey Abrams and Brian Kemp up again against each other, or it might be Shane Hazel against, more likely, Brian Kemp. I don't anticipate that happening, though. I do firmly believe that Brian Kemp or Stacey Abrams, if either of them is to win outright, it'll probably be with that 51% majority. I don't expect a runoff to occur, not with one with Shane Hazel, to say the least. But anyway, here are some clips from Georgia's gubernatorial debate.
We've been able to work to help give some relief to people despite what's happening in Washington, like giving a income tax credit back to our citizens, cutting taxes, also suspending the gas tax.
We have the money in our accounts to do what is right. Money not delivered by Brian Kemp, money delivered by federal Democrats, and money that is delivered by hardworking Georgians who have generated the surplus, and they deserve investments in their lives.
Now, as much as I'd wish to do so, I can't cover every debate that happened. But one more interesting debate that I wanted to cover was the one that occurred in Florida for their Senate election. And my goodness, that one was heated. You heard Representative Val Demings in the beginning of this program berating Senator Marco Rubio in the opening. I can't remember the line, but that was kind of the theme of the night from both sides. This race the Florida Senate race is probably one of those sleeper races where nobody's paying attention to it, even though you really should be, because it's a notable race. It's not that Val Demings is duly capable of winning this seat and ousting Marco Rubio, making him prepare for inevitable loss or vice versa, but Florida is a swing state, and that's the sole reason I think it should be watched. I think we covered the race back in 2021 because it's Florida. Anything that happens in Florida with politics, you always look at it. You look exactly at what they're saying, what the policies are, the polling, everything. And this is an interesting one with candidate quality, actually, this time, because Marco Rubio, most of us do recognize Marco Rubio for Republicans, and most of us, if we're Democrats, we know who Val Demings is. Marco Rubio ran for president in 2016, has been serving as a senator. He is trying to go for his third term. And Representative Val Demings is a member of the House of Representatives. A lot of us became familiar with her during the first impeachment of Donald Trump when she was selected as an impeachment manager. And she was also actually selected on the short list to be Joe Biden's vice president. She lost to Kamala Harris, of course, but she was on the list. So both of these candidates are nationally known. They've had national media attention. So it's interesting that this has been considered more of a sleeper race because of how well known these candidates are. But anyway, compared to when we covered this election back in 2021, things haven't changed a whole lot. Although I will say that yes, the dynamics have shifted a little, and they've become more popular, of course, as they've demanded more national attention. And it's I'd say that Val Demings may actually be not as notable, but honestly weaker in terms of one of the weaker candidates to be put up against Rubio. Now, I may be totally wrong, but that will be for the Florida voters to decide on November 8th. But anyway, here are some exchanges from the Florida Senate debate.
I sponsored a bipartisan red flag law styled after Florida, not the crazy one they just passed, a real red flag law that would allow the police department to go before a judge and remove your guns if they can prove that you are a danger.
This is about taking dangerous guns out of the hands of dangerous people. And the overwhelming majority of people in our nation want us to do just that. How long will you watch people being gunned down in first grade, fourth grade, high school, college, church, synagogue, a grocery store, a movie theater, a mall, and a nightclub,
Congresswoman,
and do nothing? They're asking themselves, what in the hell did he just say? Our primary responsibility is the safety of Floridians. And Senator, 24 years in elected office, and you have not yet risen to that occasion. And then when asked about it, you say something that makes no sense.
The midterms are coming closer and closer as we close out the year, and that means more interesting headlines, polling, and fewer chances for challengers to change the game. We here at the Ishaan S Show will keep a close watch on what goes on and bring you the latest. Thanks for joining us this week. We'll see you next time. And so that does it for us here today at the Ishaan S Show. If you liked my commentary, then go ahead and follow at Ishaan S Show on Twitter and at the Ishaan S Show on Instagram for breaking news posts and updates about the show. If you want to learn more about political news stories, then check out my political news blog on the IshaanSshow.com. Do us a favor and share this episode and all the others with your friends and family. It's the best way for this show to grow and get more people listening to it. Thanks again for all your support, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye.